Let's face it, fishing ain't cheap, but there are definitely ways to be a little bit more efficient in your spending for all of your angling, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey thinkers, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much as always for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast, brought to us once again by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Keep them in mind for all of your holiday shopping. You can ship directly to store from sportsmans.com or visit them at any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Also, for you Northern Colorado folks, don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota. They're all outdoors men and women themselves, and they know what you need in a truck or car. So, here we are, middle of November, and headed into holiday season, and fishing's a little bit winding down, and or at least changing, maybe not winding down. If you're an ice angler, you're probably getting wound up right now. I'm not an ice angler myself, so for me, the open water season is winding down, and I start looking at travel, but I take my inspiration for these podcast guys from all over the place. I don't, as you can probably tell from listening to them, I don't script them. I make a couple of notes and I start talking, and that's just how it kind of goes. Some are smoother than others, but I get the information from questions. And anytime I get the same question more than once over the course of a reasonable period of time, I start thinking about how many other people might have those same questions. And so in the last couple days, I've been out and about, smashed my phone, had to get a new phone. Long story, but I was in the store yesterday talking to a guy, and he says, man, you know, times are tough for me right this minute. I'm looking for ways. You got any tips for saving money? And I had that same question emailed to me recently as well. And I thought I'd discuss some of that at this point, because as a guy who runs a fishing business, everything that costs you money costs me money. If you burn X amount of lures or line or whatever it might be, I do the same times probably 10. And anyone out there that's a fishing guide can understand what I'm talking about, besides the fact that we travel and fish as well. And efficiency is a real thing. So I thought I'd go through some of the things that basically I have done for my whole career, or have learned throughout the course of my career, to help save myself a little bit of money along the way, and things that I see commonly in the field, some of which are more complicated, some are easier, but I see in the field that people do that end up ultimately costing them money. And so some of these are obvious, but something you don't think about. Some of them maybe less obvious, and it's something you might, it might strike a chord with you. So anyway, I'm just going to start going through them, and not necessarily in any particular order, but just ways that you can spend a little bit less money and make sure you're still fishing. And the first thing I'm going to say is don't stop fishing. Fishing less is not a good way to save money. Obviously, it is a good way, and if you want to get literal about it, but it's not a good way for your mental health. So at no point am I going to say stop fishing, but there is one thing that I might say that is very obvious, but I think gets lost on people, and that is taking advantage of what's immediately in front of you. What water do you have immediately available to you that you can fish, so that you can scratch your itch, but not necessarily make a big effort out of it? And fishing locally is something that I find a lot of guys have resistance to. They only want to fish when they can go somewhere good. And I've done whole podcasts about this, opportunity fishing, I call it. But at the end of the day, staying closer to home to fish is not a bad thing. You just have to change the talent, or the challenge, I should say, up a little bit. So, I've got a pond right down the street from my house, maybe a couple miles down the road from here, and I don't fish it very often. It's got bass and bluegills and green sunfish, a few other things in it, a bunch of catfish, but it's not a trophy fishery by any stretch. But that doesn't mean I can't go challenge myself there and not burn any gas to speak of, or minimal amount of tackle or anything else, by just going down there and trying to catch the biggest fish in that pond, or try to catch the most fish in that pond, or something like that. In other words, change the challenge up and stay local, but motivate yourself by giving yourself some sort of a challenge. Am I going to get uber impressed by catching another 10-inch largemouth in this pond? No, definitely not. But if I can figure out how to catch a 16-inch largemouth in that pond, well, now I've done something and I didn't have to go anywhere to do it. And that pond doesn't have a whole bunch of 16-inchers in there. Or maybe you set a goal, I'm going to go catch a whole bunch of them, right? I'm going to catch 20 of them, let's say. How fast can I catch 20 fish? Or whatever is quantifiable for you. But give yourself a challenge to fish locally. And then you can decide whether you succeeded or not. It's not about big fish. You don't even have to take any pictures. It's just hey, let's go out and get some fish caught and scratch the itch local. So that's an obvious one. But I also find a lot of people resistant to that. I've got a neighbor who only fishes when he can go somewhere good and then complains that he hasn't fished in a while. Well, that's fine, but we live literally next door to a lake. And I get it. It's not full of big giant fish, but at least you can scratch the itch and not complain about not fishing. And the trips he goes on are big, expensive expeditions, and they require time to save for. And I get it. I love to travel and fish too, but that doesn't mean I preclude fishing locally. And that can be both a money saver and a time saver, and not to mention an excellent way to keep your sanity. So that's the obvious one, and then I'll move on from that right away. The next one, all the next ones are going to really revolve around consumables, meaning things you go through a bunch of if you fish very much. And the obvious one there is lures, okay? And I have a lure collection that you would be shocked about based on the amount of lures I have picked up from 20 years of living around a lake. And I pick them up whenever I see them. I dig them out of trees. I use a 18-foot long fraybill, or 18, maybe it's 15 feet long fraybill plug retriever. I can reach up and get them out of trees with that. I collect lures. And at the end of the day, what I find, a high percentage of these lures are all on really thin line for what the lure is. In other words, I just picked up a big old spinnerbait about a week ago. It was a big spinnerbait. We're talking something pushing maybe 3/4 of an ounce even, big old blade on it, big old heavy bait. Whoever threw in it was swinging for the bleachers, but they were doing it on what I believe is 6-pound test. And that's a disaster, looking for a place to happen. So he threw a $10 spinnerbait, or she, on 6-pound test, and then it broke off, and you wonder why. There was about 4 inches of line on the tag end of it, and it broke off. And you can expect that. I've got the same thing with jerk baits. I've got the same thing. That whole collection, if you go look at them, a high percentage of them are on very thin line. And particularly if it's not fresh line, and we'll get back to that in a minute, that's just a disaster looking for a place to happen. You're going to go through a lot of baits. And so there's no chance that I'm not going to have my line weight match my lures. And so right off the bat, when you spool your reel, consider what you're throwing as much as anything. And it seems to me these days, particularly, a lot of people have this penchant for light line. And yes, you get a lot of bites with it. With certain lures, you can get more bites, particularly with finesse lures. But at the end of the day, it's typically not the right choice. Typically, you can use a little bit heavier line, particularly with modern line standards now, with a braid and fluoro, or blade. Excuse me, I'll try it one more time. A braid and monofilament or fluorocarbon leader on the end of it. I can downsize my leader just a little bit if I need, but at least I have the stronger running line. I see a lot of very big baits or good sized baits on line that's much lighter than it needs to be. And I've guided on this lake for 20 years, so I know I can get away with 8, 10, 12-pound test on just about anything I'm throwing and be fine. There's no reason to be throwing 6-pound tests around here, and there's definitely no reason to be mismatched with your tackle and the weight of your lure. So that's an obvious one as well. I see that one a ton. Another one I see a ton here, and it isn't necessarily resulted in these particular lures getting broke off, but it does in other cases because I've seen it a lot, and that is the use of snaps rather than tying knots directly to your lures, either snaps or snap swivels. And if you go out in my shop and you look at the number of jigs that are hanging there, and there's a pile of them. I mean, I could fish for years without having to buy jigs if these were in fishable condition. A very high percentage of them have a snap swivel on the end of them. And that's, first of all, not a good way to basically catch fish, get bites, right? You're dealing with a bait that's a very finesse-oriented bait. Fish are going to get time to look at it. The snap swivel does you no good. What it does is allow you to not tie knots. Okay, and so now what happens is you get stale knots. And so the reason that I would say at least half of the jigs that I've found hanging in the garage, or let's say conservative, say half of them have a snap or a swivel or both on them. And that's why they broke them off, because the knot gets stale. You change jigs 3 times, now it's very easy to break. And I want to point out that I almost never find these jigs stuck to anything. They're just laying on the bottom, meaning a fish shook them off, or they snagged and broke it off, pulling on the snag, and the jig just fell back to the bottom. Keep in mind, this is a rock cover lake, not a wood cover lake. But even the ones I find in and around the wood cover are just laying on the bottom. And what happens is the knot gets weak. A stale knot is the fastest way I know to waste money and give yourself a heartache. And I get people that used to argue with me on guide trips about it. But when you tie a knot and you cinch it down, it puts a weakness in the line, no matter what. With the only possible exception of being braid, and even there I will retie, just not nearly as often. But if you're throwing nylon or fluorocarbon, in other words, monofilament or fluorocarbon, what you think of as monofilament, just for the record, both fluorocarbon and nylon can be monofilaments. That's a description of how it's made. But at the end of the day, if you're throwing one of those two and you don't retie your knot relatively often, you're going to set yourself up for losing lures. And losing lures is expensive, and we don't even need to talk about losing fish. The other thing about it is if you magnifies it by the thinner the line is. So if you tie a knot in 6-pound test and you tie that same knot in 10-pound test, the 6-pound test knot will fail much easier in a hurry, because let's say you lose 10% of your tensile strength just by tying the knot, which is pretty common. Any knot that tests at 90% of its original breaking strength is considered a pretty good knot. And I can tell you, with most average people tying them, 90% is a pipe dream. Normally, people are going to be closer to 75% based on my experience of watching people on a knot testing machine at various expos over the last 20 years. Berkeley brings a knot machine and lets people try them at the Bassmaster Classic Expo. They've done that at other expos I've been to as well. And you watch people's knots break at 60, 70, 80% of the line most of the time. And then you'll get one random guy who comes in, knows how to tie a real knot, and he'll get in the 85 or 90%, 95% range. But most of the time, it doesn't matter what you read publicized, you can't duplicate that. So let's say conservatively that you're at 90% breaking strength. Well, obviously 90% of 6-pound is less than 90% of 10-pound. And so the amount of effort it takes to break, assuming the rod's the same, is going to be quite a bit less. So when you have light line, it becomes even more of an issue, and fresh knots all the time. And so get rid of the clip and the swivel, or the combo, the snap swivel as they call them. Get rid of that, tie directly, and go from there. There's a couple scenarios where I would put either a clip on the front of a bait, something like what you guys might think of as a Castmaster, I think of as a Johnson Splinter. Anything that's cross-drilled will get a clip on it, because it will cut your line in and of itself. In other words, if it's got a hole drilled through it like a spoon but no split ring, then I will either put a split ring or I'll tie a loop knot, with my strong preference being to put a split ring on there. And but that's the only scenario where I would put a clip on one, and the clip will then get retied just as often as though it was on a jig or something like that. And just to set this record straight, if I'm fishing 6-pound test, I'm going to retie that thing about every 5 minutes, maybe 10 at the outside, assuming I don't catch anything. And if I catch anything in between there, or I snag it even once, I will for sure retie it constantly. And there's been days when I'm rowing through fish on a jig bite and we've got light line, that I'll be retying that thing every 5 minutes tops. And somebody say, oh, well, you're wasting a bunch of fishing line when you do that. Okay, maybe, but I can waste 10 feet of fishing line way cheaper than I can lose one lure. So it's not a matter of that. That's not the issue at the end of the day, is how much line did I waste retying. So retying early and often is a very good way to save you a whole bunch of money, and getting rid of the clip will help you with that, because the other thing that happens with clips, and this is a bad one, and again, I don't want to harp on too much of this, but clip will open at inopportune times, particularly with jerk baits. And I have seen a pile of clips fail. And again, we've done whole podcasts on that. I do not use clips unless absolutely necessary. I would prefer to put a split ring on there and just retie all the time. So clips are bad juju, and for the record, you don't have to buy them if you don't use them. So I don't even carry them in my boat these days of any kind. So that should give you some indication of how I feel about it. So that will save you some cash right there. Along those same lines, fresh line. And again, that seems counterintuitive. You say, oh, well, buying more line does not save me money. Well, if you're talking about nylon monofilament particularly, it does not hold up well. And replacing it early and often is way cheaper again than buying, let's say that you get stale line and it costs you two hard lures. Well, those two hard lures, when you add them together, cost way more than the spool line that, as long as you kept fresh knots in, probably would have saved those lures. So key thing right there is fresh line when it comes to nylon or monofilament. Along those same lines, you want to buy less monofilament or less fluorocarbon. Use backing on your reels. I guarantee you, no matter who you are, you can't cast, at least in freshwater, any farther than about, I don't know, or not effectively anyway, maybe 100 yards at the most. So why do you need 200 yards of line on your reel that never sees daylight? So leave backing on there and leave 100 yards only of line available to top it off with. Tie a knot right there. I tie back-to-back unis there, but whatever knot you like for joining lines. And then wind your new line in on top of it and just keep replacing that new line. That's cutting in half how much line you have to use, and that will help you a whole bunch. Along those same lines, particularly that'll help you, I want to point out real quick to go back to that, with braided line on top. So I'll fill the whole bottom of a spool with whatever old mono or whatever I have laying around, and then tie braid to it and then leave it from there. And then the rest of the time that reel's in my arsenal, I'll just keep topping it with fresh line. And yes, it's an extra step of tying the line to it when I'm respooling, but it saves me cash. I don't have to buy as much line. And fresh monofilament will definitely be a benefit. It handles better, it casts better, but most importantly, when it comes to saving money, it is much more durable. And so using the backing thing. With braided line, I have also had at times in the past, I don't do it a lot anymore because of the backing thing, but I used to reverse braid pretty commonly, particularly on bait casters, where I'll take it and wind it off of one bait caster directly onto the other bait caster. For the same reason as I just said with the 200 yards of line. When you do that, the other half of it's never seen daylight. So it has no abrasion, it's had no UV, it's had minimal wear of any kind on it, and therefore by just winding it on another reel, you can replace it. So by having one extra reel around that you can use as basically a holder, you can literally swap. Let's say you had 6 bait casters, I can just reverse the line on all of them. And now I'm right back to square one. I didn't spend a dime and I have brand new line on all of them. So if you don't want to use backing, that's another opportunity to save you some cash right there. And along those same lines, checking guides on your rods and the lip on the spools of your reel or the line guide in your bait casting reel, and making sure they are smooth all the time, particularly if you have a line failure of some sort. Check those things and make sure. I had an incident earlier this year where my reel wouldn't cast right. And this is kind of off topic, but same kind of thing. I couldn't get it to cast right. I'm starting to cuss a reel, which was my favorite reel earlier in the day, and now I'm like, why will this thing not cast? And for whatever reason, I was too slow, too much of a dunce to occur to me to check other things. So instead, I started playing with the magnets on the reel. It's a casting reel. I'm starting to play with the brakes, right, to change the brakes to see why it won't cast. Well, long story short, a guide had got pinched and was pinching the line. So when I'm trying to cast, it's pinching the line. So not only did I lose an hour of fishing before I finally figured out that one of those micro guides had gotten smashed, and I didn't realize it, and the reel was fine, it was the rod that was the problem, I had also braided all that line. So and therefore I had to put fresh line on. So keep track of the condition of the guides and the spool on your reel, being a spinning reel or a casting reel, and that also will save you some money. And by the way, guides are not terribly difficult to replace. You can buy replacement guides in a lot of places, including Sportsman's Warehouse. If you have a damaged guide, replace it, or take it to a rod builder and have them replace it. So that will also help you out in saving a little bit of money, as far as your angling goes. Changing gears a little bit from the consumables like that. Carrying less weight, and let's talk about boat. If you're a boater, I want to talk about boats for a minute, because there's a lot of ways to save money as a boater, and everyone has that joke, break out another 1,000 or whatever, the acronyms for boats. At the end of the day, boats aren't cheap, but there are ways to save money in boating, and one of them is to reduce the amount of weight in your boat. And I can pretty much guarantee you that I carry a lot less weight in my boat than most people do, most hardcore anglers do, and definitely more than most bass or walleye, particularly walleye guys, carry in their boat. And some of the ways I reduce that weight is by reducing the number of heavy things that I carry in my boat on any given day. So I don't need 15 half-ounce slip sinkers in my boat. I only need 2 or 3 to get me through any given day. So I work in an offload system, almost like a just-in-time inventory for retail, right? So in my shop, I keep spares of everything. And at the end of every day, anything that I was short on or running out of just gets replenished, as opposed to having all of it in the boat. Do I need to have 100 8-ounce jig heads in my boat in 10 different colors? No, absolutely not. If I have 15 8-ounce jig heads in my boat, again, that's a weight saving. You say, oh, it's an 1/8 of an ounce, big deal, but there's a whole bunch of them. And if you multiply that by all the different sizes of jig heads, same kind of thing. You end up carrying a bunch of weight in the boat. And so I've reduced my jig head box, weighs like a quarter of what it weighed even a few years ago, and that's just one box. Then there's the terminal tackle box, same thing with crankbaits. Unless you're in some weird scenario where you're for sure going to row through a whole bunch of baits, which, by the way, I would be changing my pattern up if that was the case. Unless you're just some hardcore tournament guy that you have to catch them that day on that presentation, I would be changing some things up. But I carry basically 1 or 2 of each hard bait in the boat for a given color. And almost always, I can count on one hand the amount of times where, I didn't have the right color of jerk bait in the boat because I lost the one that I had and whatever. And usually it's a confidence thing, not a jerk bait thing. If you actually switch and keep fishing in the way you were, you'll find out that you'll still get a percentage of the fish to bite most of the time. In fact, I used to do that on guide trips all the time when I didn't have 2 of the same color, and one guy would be beating the other guy soundly, and if I had that color, I'd beat him, and all I got to do is take the rod away from one guy and hand it to the other one, and vice versa, and the same guy still catches the fish. So it comes down to other things besides the color of the jerkbait more often than not. So again, I reduce the amount of tackle that I carry in my boat. Same thing with tools, particularly on local trips. I don't carry a tremendous amount of tools. It is not the end of the world if my day gets cut short if I'm on a reasonably local trip. If I'm driving cross country to go fish somewhere, well, okay, maybe not. But if I'm running down to my local lake to go fishing, there's no reason for me to have a full toolkit and 100 8-ounce jig heads and 100 half-ounce slip sinkers for my Texas rigs or whatever in the boat. So I just reduce the weight in the boat. Another thing I reduce in the boat is my speed. And this is the hardest one for me. Anyone that knows me knows that I am a speed demon. I am a junkie for speed. I've raced motorcycles, I've raced cars. I like to go fast. More than almost anything else in the world, I like to go fast, drive fast, handle all those fun things. But the older I've gotten, the more I realize that going 60 in my boat uses 3 times the amount of fuel that going 40 in my boat does. And on top of that, and I learned this in discussion with Jacob Wheeler, by the way, who's one of the top bass, I think he's actually the top rated bass angler in the world right now. He and I were having a talk at ICAST about 5 years ago. And he was talking about all these bass guys, they get in their boat and they go full speed all over the place. And hey, I was guilty of it at that time, and I still am to some degree these days, but I'm much better about it than I used to be. He's like, they miss a whole bunch of opportunities because they're going so fast, they have to pay attention to driving the boat and not maybe what's going on the lake around them as they go by. And he's like, by slowing down to 40 miles an hour, I lose, on the average bass lake, 2 or 3 minutes of fishing time. But I get a chance to observe what's going on while I'm driving. And maybe you see birds popping somewhere that you didn't see, or notice a mud line somewhere that you hadn't noticed as you're going down the lake because you're not so worried about making sure you get there in one piece. you can just be more observant, slowing down. And the amount of fuel consumption that an outboard has, and I know because my boat has a fuel consumption gauge, I can watch it burn fuel, but older outboards don't. And when you slow down, cut your speed in half, your fuel economy goes up way more than double. So it will make a big difference for you in that regard as to how fast you're running the boat. A couple other typical things in the boat to reduce fuel consumption. And it's for the record, I have a 250 horse outboard, on the back of my bass boat. So I know about fuel consumption. It'll put some fuel away. Another thing is don't let your live wells fill unless you need them full. So instead of leaving them on empty where the weight of the boat will fill the live wells to some degree on its own, leaving the live wells empty, muy importante as far as not having weight in the boat. The more weight you have, the more fuel you'll burn at any speed, and even more so at high speed. So if you can reduce 100 pounds in your boat total between everything else, you can make a big difference in how that boat performs. And if you can reduce 200 pounds, you're talking about a big old difference in fuel economy. So keep those things in mind and keep your backups, even if they're in your pickup in the parking lot, keep a bunch of your backups elsewhere instead of in your boat, instead of having a whole season's worth of jig heads and sinkers and whatever, all the heavy stuff in your boat. So that's another thing that I think will help you save a lot of money. Another thing, and I got some tackle companies that'll probably crucify me for this one, but you don't have to have 10 new jerk baits because some company came out with a new jerk bait. Now I'm the first guy to say, hey man, there's a new lure, I'm going to try it, but I'm going to buy one of them or maybe two of them and see how that goes. I'm not going to commit to a lure until I have a whole season on it and I know that this is a thing that needs to be a staple and therefore I need to have a bunch of them. But I see a lot of guys, particularly I was at Sportsman's Warehouse the other day and I saw a guy come in there and they had a new bait on the shelf and he was all giddy. Man, I finally found these, and he's buying 8 of them. I was like, oh, have you caught some fish on those? No, I haven't tried them yet. Well, why are you buying 8 of them right off the bat? And those kinds of things. But that's a common thing that I see. So don't get caught up in that. Try a bait. Get a bait, try it, see how it works, and then go from there and see if you actually need more of them or if you don't. And again, somebody's going to say, well, I need a bunch of colors. Well, then get 2 of them. Get a light one and a dark one, or get a shiny one and a natural one. Just, again, minimize what you spend in the beginning until you're sure you like that bait, and then go from there. You don't have to have a whole selection of everything that comes out. And then another one is a common one is you see trends developing, and you got to have it. I got to have that. I got to have a whole bunch of those because that's what everybody's doing. Well, if you're catching fish, a classic one for me was a Gulp minnow, and the Gulp minnow was doing really good for me. I was catching all kinds of fish with it. The Ned rig came out, became popular. Oh man, how often do you fish Ned rigs? Oh, Ned rig. People are buying specialty jig heads and all that, and I get it. I totally understand. It was a big old trend for a while, and it's an effective bait. I'm not in any way, shape, or form knocking the Ned rig. It's an excellent way to catch bass. But all it is a blunt-ended Gulp minnow. And so since I'm already fishing a Gulp minnow, and I already have a bunch of jig heads for that, and I already have a bunch of the soft bodies for that, I don't need to then stock up on a Ned rig when I can literally fish a Gulp minnow the same way that you fish a Ned rig. It's still 3 inches long. I can still have it on a round head jig head. The key is drag it on the bottom like a Ned. That's the only difference. And in having conversations with Ned Cale, who invented, or Cayley, I don't even know how you say his last name, but conversation with having him who invented the Ned rig, the only thing it is a straight body, drug on the bottom, doesn't leave the bottom. If it does, it doesn't leave more than about 6 inches. That's it. No appendages, no wobbling tails, no nothing. Very, very similar to a Gulp minnow, which is just a pointy Ned rig. So just because there's some trend out there doesn't mean you have to have all of those things. Don't get caught up in they're catching them because they have those. In fact, it's funny. I always like to watch when baits come full circle. I know bass guys right now that'll pay you $50 or $75 for an old wiggle wart that at the time they cussed because they didn't run straight. So, but then everyone realizes, oh, now wait a minute, and it's old school. You can buy 15 different lures that are similar to an old wiggle wart that was made during a specific time frame, and the reason everyone likes them is they were inconsistent. They didn't run the same. These days they all run the same, and then people covet the old ones. So same thing with old spinner baits with vinyl skirts on them. I've seen that one. in other words, stuff that was old that you may have laying around comes back into popularity, and you don't have to have everything that's out there as far as that goes. And that'll save you a little bit of cash as well. And then I think that when it comes to buying tackle, I'm going to talk just a little bit on durable stuff. Durable being the opposite of consumable, meaning something like a rod, a reel, sunglasses, whatever, stuff that you're going to have for hopefully years at a time. When you're buying fishing rods, let's specifically talk about fishing rods, consider what you're going to cast with that fishing rod. So if I'm going to troll with it, I can buy a very inexpensive rod. I don't have to have a big expensive rod if I'm going to troll with it, because I don't need it to be exceptionally light. I don't need it to be sensitive. And those are the things that make rods expensive. Durable rods are cheap to make. Ugly sticks are less expensive, and they're ultimately the best value because they last forever. Well, I don't need to have a really high-end modulus graphite rod to troll with, right? Conversely, I don't really have to have a really expensive rod to throw a spinnerbait or a crankbait with. As long as it's a reasonably well put together rod, my spinnerbait rods are probably a quarter the cost, or probably a third the cost of my finesse jig rods. So by splitting my budget based on the application of the rod, I don't need a high-end rod for a spinnerbait. I need a high-end rod for a jig that I need to keep track of in 40 feet of water that only weighs 1/8 of an ounce. More so than I need for a half-ounce spinnerbait I'm going to throw up against visible cover and see it the whole time. And as long as that tip is soft enough I can roll cast it, I'm good to go. And so I can get away with throwing a $75 rod as a considering myself as a reasonably highly skilled angler, for not to sound arrogant, but I've been throwing baits for a long time. I can get away with a $75 rod easily and throwing a spinnerbait around or a crankbait around. But when I'm throwing my finesse jig around, all of a sudden you're extremely handicapped. And there I need to have a very light, very finesse, sensitive oriented rod. And that's where you spend your money. So picking those things is very good as well. And if you're only going to carry a few rods, get away from duplicates. Make sure that they are just far enough apart that they do slightly different things, in the same way that a 7-iron hits a golf ball different than a 4-iron or a 5-iron does. You don't want to have, when you have a limited budget for buying tackle, you don't want to have a 6-iron, 7-iron, 8-iron, 9-iron. You want to have maybe a 4-iron, a 6-iron, and a 9-iron, right? And therefore, I can cover all of my bases with a slight adjustment to my swing, rather than having a specific club for every specific thing. If you're Tiger Woods and you're fishing tournaments all the time and okay, I get it. You got to have a rod for everything. If not, just make sure your rods are spread out to do specifically what you want them to do, and avoid getting rods that are too close together or too close to being duplicates of each other. So that's another one that'll help you out. And then I want to touch on real quick on a fly rod situation, a fly angler situation, because a gentleman I was talking to about 2 weeks ago was talking about how fly fishing, how he'd figured out that he really didn't need to spend near as much money on certain parts of his fly tackle. And I agreed with him 100%. It was a great conversation we had. He's like, what I figured out is you need to spend your money on the rod and the line. And that's it when it comes to fly fishing. All the rest of it is you can get away with basic stuff. You can buy an old school Fluger medalist and catch just as many fish as you can on some crazy hardy high-end reel. That doesn't mean you won't get more satisfaction from the hardy reel, or it's lighter or whatever, but it's not going to catch you more fish unless you're talking about a saltwater situation where you have to rely on a drag and this, that, and the other. But freshwater guys rarely even get fish on the reel. So the reel is just holding line. You don't need to spend a lot of money on it. Conversely, if you don't spend a reasonable amount of money and get a good quality rod and line, you'll frustrate yourself to no end because it doesn't cast well. And that's important. Or the line has a bunch of memory or stiction where it sticks to the water or sticks to your fingers, things like that. So fly lines are highly technical, and there's a reason they're expensive. And buying a $30 fly line and an $80 fly line, they are not even going to be in the ballpark of the same. So spend the money on the rod and the line, save the money on the reel and the fly selection, because there again, Same as a lure selection, you don't have to have one of everything. And there's a lot of guys that think you do, but you don't. Same thing with tippet. You don't have to have every size of tippet. You can get away with a lot less than that than you need. There's a lot of ways. You don't have to have flies that are both weighted and unweighted. You can always add a small amount of weight to the line if you need to. There's lots of ways around it with fly fishing as well. So when it comes to saving money, it's really about thinking through each thing and how it affects your ability to actually catch fish. And I want to throw out one more thing in closing here. I walk banks a lot and fish. The equipment I use to walk banks costs probably a quarter of what the equipment I use to have in my boat, because bank fishing is a lot less technical and it's a lot harder on tackle. So when they're in my boat, they're going to lay on a carpeted deck. The reels aren't going to get any rash. Then when it gets time to leave, they're going to go in a rod tube in the rod locker, and they're going to be protected all the time. But for bank fishing, not the case. You're going to set them down in the dirt. You're going to set them on the rocks. You're going to have no choice when it comes to handling fish, and spend less money on that tackle, because then if you break it, you step on it, you drop it on the rock, and it roughs the blank up, something like that. That's no good. And along those same lines, my last thing, get rod socks. They're like Chinese handcuff material. It's woven plastic. When you stretch them, they get tight. When you push them together, they get fatter. Get rod socks. They are very inexpensive. If you're going to fish with even decent quality rods, a rod sock for $1 or $2, let's say that rod was $75, okay, which is bottom end of a decent rod these days. Call it $100 for easy math. If you're going to spend $100 on a rod, spend $2 more, $3 more, and get the rod sock to put on it, because that will keep things off of the blank in transit and in storage. And in so doing, you will have less chance of disrupting the hoop strength on that blank or the scrim or anything else. And that's what makes rod break. They don't break from just basic use. They break from anything that roughs up the surface of the rod itself. Carbon fiber tubing is really strong, so long as it doesn't get abraded or roughed up, sanded on, anything like that, or crushed. And the rod sock will help you with both of those things, not to mention help you with tangling as well. So very, very handy, but more importantly, keep durability for the rods. When my rods are in the truck, every single one of them all the time is covered in a case or a rod sock, so that if they vibrate together, they don't rub on each other. If something, whatever, rubs on them, they rub on something in the truck, nothing. And same thing in my rod locker. If the guide on one rubs on the blank of another while you're going down the lake, it's going to rub a mark in the blank, and that's where it's going to break. And it might not break for a week, but it'll break sometime. So that's my spiel on some simple ways to save some money based on some conversations I just had with people. Hopefully they resonate with you. Sorry this one went a little bit long, guys. I appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully subscribe wherever you are. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. That would be very appreciated. And like I said, new season of Fishful Thinker will come out on World Fishing Network and Altitude Sports at the very end of next month. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.